Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir's recent and first ever visit to Russia resulted in closer military and economic relations. Bashir recently stated that his country needed protection from aggressive U.S. foreign policy against Muslim-majority nations. President Bashir is treading a fine line as his relations with the U.S. are also better than ever with the lifting of long-standing trade embargoes. Bashir also stated the secession of war-ravaged South Sudan was also the result of U.S. policy. Join Africa Today for an illuminating update on U.S. policy in Sudan.
In his first visit to Russia, Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir stated that his country faced great pressure and potential aggression from the US. He stated that the US has plans to divide the already divided Sudan into 5 separate states and blames them for ravaging the Arab world, referencing the situations in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq as examples. Early in October, the US announced an end to sanctions against the country. A month earlier, Sudan was removed from a controversial travel ban list comprising of Muslim-majority nations. Relations with the US have been difficult for some time, with Washington imposing a tough trade embargo against Khartoum, accusing the country of being a safe haven for Osama bin Laden, who is alleged to have spent 5 years there before he was expelled in 1996. After its international isolation due to the 20-year trade embargo, Sudan has stated that it is rebuilding its international relations based on mutual interest. With South Sudan's continuing civil war on its borders, Africa Today asks whether al-Bashir is right to point the finger at America.
A very warm welcome to Africa Today with me, Vuiswa Ngobongwana. Africa's largest nation is facing a new era in foreign relations and could be caught between 2 giants, Russia and the United States of America. Here with me to discuss U.S. foreign policy in Sudan are Mr. Omowale Rupert, a member of Ukombozi, and Femi Okutubo, the editor-in-chief of the Trumpet newspaper. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Omowale, if I could start, I'm curious about your organization, Ukombozi. Now that's a very Bantu-sounding language. What does that mean? What do you do?
It's the Swahili word for liberation. Right. We chose that name because liberation is obviously our objective, but the Swahili language is the 10th most widely spoken language in the world and the most widely spoken language in Africa. It's the language that the old OAU had agreed would be the language to take us forward in terms of unity of speech, etc.
And you help to raise awareness about African struggles in the diaspora?
Yes, absolutely,
okay.
Absolutely. And to make linkages with sisters and brothers and organisations back home to provide platforms for them here in Britain.
Exactly, and one way you might do that is by literally blowing your own trumpet with the Trumpet newspaper that belongs to Mr. Femi Okutubo. Now, people may have known about your paper, but just a few words about it. It's long-standing, isn't it?
It is long-standing. It's been around for 22 years, and it's out there to promote the positive image of Africa and Africans around the world.
Brilliant, brilliant. And as you put your spotlight on the Sudan and look at this foreign policy initiative, this link with Russia, it's historic in more ways than one, isn't it, Femi?
It is, you know, historic in the sense that this is a country that, you know, has tried as much as, you know, that has had its own challenges. You know, that's where you have the world's youngest country that has actually, you know, was capped out a few years ago.
Yes,
and at the same time,
South Sudan.
South Sudan. And you now have a situation where, you know, I think right now, it's probably good times for Sudan in the sense that for quite a number of years, it's had sanctions against it, which was lifted recently. At the same time, it's been able to cut some giants, you know, so you've got, you know, you've got Russia, for example, which is trying to cut at the moment. And obviously that puts it in a very unique position in terms of foreign relations.
And as you look at it, and really think about the Pan-African perspective, Omar Wale, and the role of Sudan. It's the largest landmass area within Africa. I mean, huge potential. Couldn't you fit about four European nations within there? And as you look at its geopolitical importance, how do you see this particular visit by al-Bashir to Russia?
Sudan is actually the size of Western Europe. It's a little bit larger than the whole of Western Europe put together. So it's very interesting. I'm talking about the original borders as distinct
before the secession,
the recent partition.
Yes.
Sudan, what happens in Sudan is very much a reflection of what happens in Africa in general. Mm-hmm. So you had the divide between North and South, which is very much a microcosm of the divide between the North and South of the continent. Yeah. And somehow what happens in Sudan is like a blueprint or a warning
for what's
coming for the whole of our continent.
So how would you summarize U.S. foreign policy on Sudan, bearing that in mind, Femi?
Again, yes, Sudan is meant to be, it's treated as an African country, but at the same time, you cannot also ignore the Arab links with Sudan, and also the Islam links as well.
Yes.
And then when you look at what has happened, especially in terms of the role that Sudan has played in terms of counter-terrorism, that has to a large extent put Sudan maybe in the good books of US in terms of its foreign policy. And I think that's one of the reasons why in recent times the US has seen Sudan as a potential ally and has decided to sort of improve relations with Sudan.
Well, it would seem that the US has to engage with Sudan regardless, for all the reasons already stated. And the president's visit to Russia was an opportunity to discuss the key issues in the cooperation of the two countries for defense and international relations. Bashir used the platform to warn that his country needs protection from the aggressive policies of the US.
We are against US involvement in the domestic affairs of the Arab countries. Our country split into two parts because of American politics. What's going on in Syria at the moment is also the result of American involvement. It's because of this that such a catastrophe happened in Syria. We believe that peace can't be reached with President Bashar al-Assad. If it weren't for Russia's involvement in Syria, the country would have been lost.
Wow, that's a very firm statement. Omar Wale, do you think that was a smart move on al-Bashir's part?
I have to say that honesty is very often a good policy. US Satan is a danger not only to Sudan, but to
the
whole of Africa. He
called them out, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, he issued a statement where he was suggesting that they were intending to balkanize the Sudan.
Yeah.
That's a very, very serious move. It has a history. We know that the whole of Africa was balkanized back in 1884, 85.
By balkanized, you mean split into separate parts?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so what you had was a situation where Africa was partitioned, that we were weakened through that partitioning, and then European imperialist nations, as it were at the time, then went to war and did all kinds of
playing
things
one against the other. But let me come to you, Femi. Is there some validity to this statement? Because it's quite a bold statement to talk about the potential breaking up of a country yet again.
To me, I see it more as a strategic statement on the part of Bashir. I think he's playing a strategic game. Initially, it would appear that the relationship between US and Sudan are meant to be improving. But at the same time, I think he's also trying to protect his position as well, because there are already signals that, for example, the US is not likely to support his move to remain in office for the next elections. And I think what he has just done is thrown out a clanger, thrown out a dummy out there to sort of give the impression that, okay, I want to work with Russia. Now, there's still a strong possibility that based on, if he weighs his, by the time he weighs his options, he might, United States may even be forced to sort of want to do business with him, so to speak.
Okay, well, do you think that this might start a Twitter war with President Trump, Omowale? What do you think he feels about this?
I have to say, I'm not greatly concerned with Trump of all
But
characters.
he will respond, obviously.
Yes, I mean, obviously he's going to make some kind of response. I think the way I see things developing, if I can put it in those terms, is that the threat is a real threat.
Yes.
That if you split a people, what you do is you create little enclaves which you can conquer separately. It means that if you attack one micronation, the other nations think it's got nothing to do with them. And so for that reason, they don't operate to defend that nation.
But how does this move by President Bashir affect or impact the current secession? You're talking about, you know, speculating on splitting it into 5. It's already split into 2. What's the likely impact on South Sudan?
Well, there are arm deals going on at the moment. Very significant arm deals. We're talking about air power. Yeah. So there's an air superiority in Sudan, which is now, much greater than any other nation or micronation in the region.
Well, I would say perhaps even in Africa, because those are 4th generation Russian fighter jets that were sold.
Absolutely. And so what it means is that in a military situation, in a war situation, air power really helps to determine who is going to win the ground battle. And so Sudan therefore becomes, quote unquote, a threat, potentially, to neighbours.
Well, and also, could it be a threat internally within Sudan itself? Because I'm sure the figures haven't been published, but they must be huge in terms of expenditure. And we're always talking about the impoverished people of Sudan. How will this be taken internally?
Naturally, to the common man in the streets of Sudan, they wouldn't want to see their country go to war.
Sure.
They wouldn't want to see, a further breaking down of the country. South Sudan obviously doesn't seem to have worked, in terms of the troubles and the war that has now broken out in that end of town.
Yes.
So, again, I think it's always been a well-known strategy of any power that you divide and rule.
Okay.
So obviously from the foreign perspective, if what Bashir is saying is true, then it's definitely a way of trying to further weaken the Sudan president and for the foreigners to actually, get their way in Sudan. And more importantly, there's also an economic angle to it.
Yeah.
Obviously, if there's war, that means more armed deals.
Yes.
In terms of either trying to defend the territory, and that can only mean better business and more revenue for the United States.
But also it could potentially mean more destruction and distraction for the people of Sudan. Let's see what you've been saying on our social media pages on this topic. Our first comment, and they're all from Sudan, by the way. Our first comment is from Sina. Sina says, Russia is one of the very few countries in the world that can support Sudan in their need in terms of development and solve other problems. The biggest problem is the US, and Russia is experienced in dealing with that regime. So you think he's actually fastened his boat to the right giant in terms of dealing with potential US aggression, Omowale?
It's difficult to dance in the middle of elephants. It's a very dangerous place to be dancing. I think al-Bashir's got little option. Yeah. We're speaking here about US and Russia. Remember, China is also a part of this equation.
Yes.
And we can't leave them out. One of the reasons why Sudan has been able to maneuver is because it develops a level of relationship with China.
Yes.
It was able to, in effect, defeat the trade embargo.
Got 2 big giants on its side. Right, well, not everyone is supportive of President al-Bashir. Ahmed from Sudan says, I believe Omar al-Bashir is a power-hungry tyrant who should be nowhere near any seats of government, but well done to him for calling out the US so early. Early diagnosis of US disease can prevent many problems. Very interesting point there, but let's continue on to our final comment from the Sudan, from Nabil, who says that we need a strong but fair leader. I say yes to resistance against America, but we need a fresh government who is loyal and fair to its people. Our economy needs 5 years of recovery before any more conflict escalation. Well, President al-Bashir has been in power since 1989, which is quite a long time. How much longer? Do make sure that you let us know what you think about the issues all over the continent, and this is how you can do so. We talked about the potential for internal unrest as a result of this decision for closer links with Russia. I'd like to come to you, Femi. Let's talk a little bit more about South Sudan. This conflict, it's defined as a civil war internal to South Sudan. But obviously Sudan can't ignore what's going on its own borders. It
cannot. And don't forget historically as well that South Sudan itself seceded from from Sudan. So obviously there are implications there. And the mere fact that it's actually happening on its border,
yes,
there's bound to be a spillover if care is not taken, either directly or indirectly on Sudan as a country itself.
Right.
When you also look at the geographical location of Sudan, in terms of the fact that it's almost like a connector between the north and east of Africa, that it really puts Sudan in a peculiar position, and it is not in its interest to actually have, any further war going on because of the implications that is likely to happen even on its own people within the country.
And do you agree with President al-Bashir, Omowale, when he blames U.S. foreign policy for the secession in the first place? Isn't that just ignoring the needs of those people in South Sudan who didn't feel heard?
It is US Satan that was behind the separation of Sudan. We're not saying that there are not real problems on the ground that needed solving, but whether creating a landlocked country near the center of Africa was a solution to the problem is something that I think we can look now and see quite clearly it wasn't. Wherever you have a landlocked country, it is dependent on the nations around it. So we see the richest part of the continent, the Congo, landlocked. Well, there is actually a little way out in the way that the lines were drawn, but essentially landlocked.
Yes.
And what you have is war around it, and the war pulls in all of the neighboring nations.
Yes.
Now, South Sudan will, with its civil war, pull in the neighboring nations, and it will most definitely pull in Sudan because of the historical link that Femi has just alluded to.
Right,
so
right.
What we have is a disaster developing in South Sudan, which is going to have implications for all of the nations around and the entirety of the African continent.
And how do you think, could you understand, Femi, how President al-Bashir could have come to the conclusion of blaming America for his country being split into two? Or is that just too simplistic?
To a large extent, I think it's simplistic. It's not uncommon for leaders not to really see sometimes that they themselves are even the problem in the first instance.
Yes.
You're talking about somebody who's been in power, for, well, at that time, well over 20 years.
Yes.
The economy of the country wasn't really in its best state. You had people within the country who were struggling in terms of their, of their survival. So in the first instance, if one does not create the environment that would allow external intervention in the first instance, then it wouldn't happen.
Yes.
So I think it's very important that one highlights that, that point, that some of the problems are actually internal some of the problems are actually, you know, man-made and directly from outside the country. Now, that is not to say, and that is not to ignore the role of countries like the United States of America in terms of what is, you know, happening in the country, and one must acknowledge that. But I think it's a combination of both.
Well, indeed, President Bashir does blame the breakup of Sudan on the U.S. very firmly, and it is the U.S. who has yet again made another threat, this time against South Sudan, in the event that the government does not end the violence there.
Words are no longer sufficient. The United States is prepared to pursue additional measures against the government, or any party for that matter, if they do not act to end the violence and ease the suffering in South Sudan.
It is counterproductive to impose targeted sanctions, counterproductive to impose an arms embargo. Such measures will not help to break this deadlock and will only further exacerbate the crisis. We view as unjust the ongoing attempts to place all the blame for the persistent, unabated violence on Juba alone. It has done its role. Now, the opposition must reciprocate.
Some very aggressive sounding words there. I mean, what does this, well, it's a threat. What does it mean for the region, Omawale?
Well, I mean, U.S. Satan's interest is resource-driven, as usual. You know, so they're looking for oil, in particular in this instance. They want to be able to control. From the external point of view, what they wanted the separation for was for them to have at least a part of Sudan which was under their control. It hasn't gone to plan. The new government has not been able to deliver what U.S. Satan wanted from them. And so what we have is, you know, the continuation of war. There is going to be a continuation of war. The U.S. Satan wants its agenda, and the people on the ground will obviously want something different. The fact that Sudan is actually being very seriously armed at the moment, I think, is another factor that may contribute to a bloody war, something that Sudan has experienced with Anyanya 1 and Anyanya 2 over so many years now.
Understood. Well, it's pretty clear where our brother Omawale stands, especially with his use of the word U.S. Satan, you know, in terms of what he thinks of American policy. But as you look long-term, to close off our program, Femi, what do you think the long-term impact will be? Because there has been an accusation that Muslim-majority countries are being targeted. Will this continue?
I believe it will continue, especially under President Donald Trump. He's made his position extremely clear on that. The only Muslim countries he's friends with are those who, for example, can bring in business or where he has business interests and so on and so forth. Now, at this particular point, and from what we see, Sudan definitely is not one of such countries in terms of, you know, beneficial business.
But Saudi Arabia is, isn't it?
Saudi Arabia is.
And Sudan is very friendly with Saudi Arabia.
They are, but like I said, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, so anything can change. So it's a bit, you know, it's actually a bit difficult to really predict where things are going to, you know, end up, so to speak.
Okay, well, we will definitely keep you updated on whatever happens, particularly as we look at the situation within South Sudan. That is all the time we have for today, but we will always keep you updated on Sudan and any other area of Africa. Many thanks to today's guests, Omawale Rupert and Femi Okutubo. See you next week, but for now, from me, Vuiswang Obongwana, keep watching Press TV. Thanks for watching.